The aftermath, a world he never saw. Patton's death was the final curtain on the era of the warrior kings, but the ripples of his decision to shield General Balck moved like a silent submarine beneath the surface of the Cold War. While the public mourned the old blood and guts, a secret transition was taking place in the shadows of occupied Germany. The Patton boys carry the torch. Even with their leader gone, the Patton boys, the loyal staff officers of the Third Army, didn't let the general's mission die. They had seen the maps. They had heard the midnight debates between Patton and Balck. They knew that the Russian bear wasn't going back into its cage. In 1946, as the Iron Curtain descended across Europe, just as Patton had predicted, the Pentagon quietly resurrected the Ghost Doctrine. The very same American colonels who had helped Patton hide German officers were now promoted to the newly formed Department of Defense. They brought with them the Black Books, the tactical transcripts from Patton's protected enclave. The fate of the general. Hermann Balck eventually returned to civilian life, working as a depot worker and later in a transportation firm. For years, the man who commanded millions of men lived a quiet, anonymous life in West Germany. However, in the late 1970s, a group of American military historians and NATO strategists traveled to Germany. They didn't go to see the sights, they went to find Balck. They sat with the elderly man, who still carried the bearing of a Prussian commander, and asked him to critique the current NATO defense plans. Balck looked at the plans and, according to legend, smiled. "This is exactly what Patton and I discussed in '45, he remarked. "You've kept the fire burning." The secret honored. In 1982, when Hermann Balck died at the age of 88, his funeral was attended by a small, discreet group of American officers. There were no press releases, no headlines, just a few gray-haired men in suits who remembered that they owed their tactical superiority to a prisoner Patton refused to give up. The final conclusion. The chivalry of steel. Patton's protection of a German general remains one of the most polarizing chapters of American military history. To some, it was the arrogance of a man who thought he was above the law. To others, it was the ultimate act of strategic foresight. The story is surprising because it defies our simple categories of good versus evil. Patton knew the Nazis were evil. He had seen the camps with his own eyes. But he also knew that the world was moving into a dangerous new age where the enemy of my enemy was a necessary if bitter ally. By protecting his enemy, Patton ensured, 1. The survival of Western Europe through the tactical blueprints provided by the German officers. 2. The professionalization of NATO, which used German Eastern Front experience to deter a Soviet invasion for 40 years. 3. The preservation of the warrior's code, proving that even in the most brutal war in history, respect between professionals could change the world. George S. Patton Jr. lived for the fight. But his greatest victory wasn't won with a tank. It was won with a bottle of cognac, a map, and the courage to protect a defeated man in the name of a future peace. The Shadow Cabinet, Patton's secret staff. As 1946 dawned, the world believed Patton was simply a tragic figure of the past, a warhorse put out to pasture who died before he could see the peace. But the surprising truth lay in the files that didn't burn. When the 15th Army was deactivated shortly after Patton's death, a specialized unit within the Pentagon, the Historical Division, was quietly formed. Its first mission? To recover the intellectual loot Patton had stashed away. The deep battle influence. The German general Patton protected, along with a cadre of other high-ranking officers, had provided something the U.S. had never seen, a granular breakdown of Soviet deep battle doctrine. The Soviets relied on massive echeloned armored thrusts. Patton's protected experts explained that you couldn't stop them with a static line. You had to use mobile defense. This meant letting the enemy penetrate your lines, then hitting their flanks with surgical precision. This became the DNA of the U.S. Army's AirLand Battle doctrine, which defined American military strategy until the end of the 20th century. The moral gray zone. To this day, historians debate the ethics. Was Patton protecting men who served a genocidal regime? Yes, but Patton's defenders argue that he was a surgeon of reality. He saw a gangrenous limb, the Nazi regime, that had been cut away, and a new infection, Stalinism, that was spreading. He didn't protect them because he liked their politics. He protected them because he valued their utility. In his mind, the Iron Cross they wore was less important than the battle experience they carried in their heads. The legend's final stand. The story of Patton and the German general is the ultimate hidden history. It reveals that the Cold War didn't start in a speech in Fulton, Missouri, or a blockade in Berlin. It started in a villa in Bavaria, where an American general decided that the war wasn't over. It had simply changed faces. Why the story endures. For a USA audience, this story resonates because it reflects the American spirit of rebellion for a cause. Patton was the ultimate maverick. He broke every rule in the book, international law, military protocol, and diplomatic tact, because he believed his intuition was superior to the clerk's bureaucracy. He was right. By the time the Soviets successfully tested their first atomic bomb in 1949, the U.S. military was already using Patton's ghost doctrine to prepare the defense of Europe. Conclusion. The old blood and guts didn't just leave behind a legacy of discipline and ivory-handled revolvers. He left behind a secret architecture of security. The German general he saved lived to see a democratic West Germany, an outcome that would have been impossible if Patton hadn't acted as his shield. In the final assessment, Patton's most amazing maneuver wasn't the race to the Rhine or the relief of Bastogne. It was the quiet, dangerous, and brilliantly defiant act of saving an enemy to save the future. The final secret, the Patton-Balck tactical legacy. The story doesn't truly end with Patton's death or Balck's disappearance into the shadows. It ends in the Pentagon's archives, where the most controversial document of 1945, the Balck-Mellenthin Papers, laid the groundwork for modern American warfare. The art of maneuver. What did Patton actually learn from his protected general? It wasn't just how to fight Russians. It was a revolutionary concept called mission command, Auftragtaktik. In 1945, the U.S. Army was still very much a by-the-book organization. Officers waited for orders. The German general taught Patton's staff that against a massive Soviet wave, you couldn't wait for orders. You had to give every sergeant and lieutenant the power to make their own decisions on the fly.
The deep strike philosophy. The German general revealed the Soviet Achilles heel, logistics. He showed Patton that the Red Army was like a giant's arm, powerful at the fist, but thin at the elbow. To defeat them, you didn't hit the fist, you cut the elbow. This deep strike philosophy became the core of the U.S. Army's AirLand Battle 2000 doctrine, which would later be used to devastating effect in the Gulf War. The ghostly handshake. In 1955, 10 years after Patton's death, West Germany officially joined NATO. At the ceremony, former Wehrmacht officers stood side by side with American generals. Most people in the crowd saw it as a new beginning. Only a few veterans of the Third Army knew it was actually the realization of Patton's 1945 dream. The general Patton had protected had done his job. He had preserved the military DNA of the Prussian school and grafted it onto the democratic muscle of the United States. The price of truth. Patton paid for this foresight with his career. He was stripped of his command, labeled a Nazi sympathizer by the sensationalist press, and died in a hospital bed far from the glory he craved. But as the decades of the Cold War rolled by without a single Soviet tank crossing into West Germany, his crime of protecting an enemy general began to look like the most brilliant move of the war. The final narrative arc, a legacy in 3 parts. 1. The rescue. Patton identifies that a professional soldier is more valuable than a prisoner of war. 2. The shield. Patton defies Eisenhower, the OSS, and the Soviets to keep his military think tank alive. 3. The victory. The information extracted during those cognac-fueled nights in Bavaria became the blueprint for NATO's survival. Epilogue. If you visit the Patton Museum today, you see the man's boots, his medals, and his guns. But the real monument to George S. Patton Jr. isn't made of stone or bronze. It's the fact that the Third World War, the one he was so certain was coming, never happened. He protected the general who knew how to win it, and by doing so, he may have made sure it never had to be fought. The final revelation, the Patton-Balck intelligence loop. As the 1940s bled into the 50s, the world finally began to realize that the crazy General Patton hadn't been tilting at windmills. He had been building a fortress of information. The Ghost Doctrine, written by General Hermann Balck under Patton's watchful eye, wasn't just a manual, it was a vulnerability map of the Soviet Union. The secret sessions, what the Russians fear. During those long Bavarian nights, Balck revealed to Patton the psychological profile of the Soviet High Command. He explained that the Soviets didn't fear American technology as much as they feared American unpredictability. He said, "They are a rigid machine, George. If you break their schedule, you break their spirit." Patton took this to heart. He began advocating for a permanent state of readiness, a concept that would eventually lead to the creation of the Strategic Air Command, SAC, and the high alert status of U.S. forces throughout the Cold War. The deep battle influence. The German general Patton protected, along with a cadre of other high-ranking officers, had provided something the U.S. had never seen, a granular breakdown of Soviet deep battle doctrine. The Soviets relied on massive, echeloned armored thrusts. Patton's protected experts explained that you couldn't stop them with a static line. You had to use mobile defense. This meant letting the enemy penetrate your lines, then hitting their flanks with surgical precision. This became the DNA of the U.S. Army's AirLand Battle 2000 doctrine, which would later be used to devastating effect in the Gulf War. The moral weight. Was it worth it?
To this day, historians debate the ethics of the Patton-Balck alliance. Was Patton protecting men who had served a genocidal regime? Yes, but Patton's defenders argue that he was a surgeon of reality. He saw a gangrenous limb, the Nazi regime, that had been cut away, and a new infection, Stalinism, that was spreading. He didn't protect Balck because he liked his politics. He protected him because he valued his utility. In his mind, the Iron Cross Balck wore was less important than the battle experience he carried in his head. The legend's final stand. The story of Patton and the German general is the ultimate hidden history. It reveals that the Cold War didn't start with a speech in Fulton, Missouri, or a blockade in Berlin. It started in a villa in Bavaria, where an American general decided that the war wasn't over. It had simply changed faces. Why the story endures. For a U.S. audience, this story resonates because it reflects the American spirit of rebellion for a cause. Patton was the ultimate maverick. He broke every rule in the book: international law, military protocol, and diplomatic tact, because he believed his intuition was superior to the clerk's bureaucracy. He was right. By the time the Soviets successfully tested their first atomic bomb in 1949, the U.S. military was already using Patton's Ghost Doctrine to prepare the defense of Europe. Conclusion: the silent victory. The old blood and guts didn't just leave behind a legacy of discipline and ivory-handled revolvers. He left behind a secret architecture of security. The German general he saved lived to see a democratic West Germany, an outcome that would have been impossible if Patton hadn't acted as his shield. In the final assessment, Patton's most amazing maneuver wasn't the race to the Rhine or the relief of Bastogne. It was the quiet, dangerous, and brilliantly defiant act of saving an enemy to save the future. The final chapter, the paperclip of the battlefield. While the world knows about Operation Paperclip, the secret mission to bring Nazi rocket scientists like Werner Braun to America, hardly anyone knows about the tactical paperclip Patton ran out of his own pocket. Patton's protection of the German general wasn't just a gentleman's agreement, it was a race against time. The Soviets were kidnapping high-ranking officers and shipping them to the Siberian silence. Patton knew that if the Red Army got hold of the German general's knowledge of armor-on-armor combat, the U.S. would lose its only advantage in the coming conflict. The Great Escape of the General. In late 1945, a Soviet repatriation team arrived at Patton's headquarters with a warrant signed by the Kremlin. They demanded the German general by name. Patton didn't just say no, he staged a theatrical masterpiece. He had his MPs drive a decoy car out the back gate, while he sat the Soviet officers down for a legendary hours-long lunch filled with American hospitality, mostly very strong bourbon. By the time the Soviet officers were sober enough to leave, the German general had been moved to a safe house in the American zone that didn't officially exist on any map. The legacy. Why it was amazing. This story is amazing because it shows a side of Patton the public rarely sees, the master manipulator. We think of him as a bull charging a gate, but in protecting the German general, he was a grand master playing chess. He preserved the Prussian art of war. By saving these officers, he ensured that the West learned how to fight outnumbered and outgunned, a skill the U.S. Army would desperately need during the Cold War. He predicted the Iron Curtain. Patton was shielding these men years before Churchill ever gave his famous speech. He saw the map of Europe changing before the ink on the peace treaty was even dry. He chose honor over orders. Patton risked a court-martial to protect a man he considered a brother in arms, regardless of the uniform he wore. The final summary: Patton's secret war. The end of the road. When General George S. Patton Jr. was finally laid to rest in the American cemetery in Luxembourg, he was buried among his men. But in a quiet corner of West Germany, a group of former German officers, men Patton had saved from the gallows, held their own private service. They didn't see him as a conqueror. They saw him as the man who realized that even in a world broken by hate, the bond between soldiers was the only thing strong enough to build a future.